So, Michael, you have a new book out, Think Twice, a sort of anti-blink, and it's really about the way that people need to reconsider their decision making. And I thought the most brilliant vignette at the start was the story of the man who wrote the book about human gullibility and how to avoid the problem of being fooled, and who turned out to be an investor in Bernie Madoff's funds.
Yeah, so the theme of the book, Philip, is that in certain types of situations, our minds are likely to take us down one path, when the right way to think about it is another one. Often people think about good decision makers as being really smart people, high IQ people. And that story of Professor Greenspan, no relation to the former Fed chair, is a great one. So he's a developmental psychologist, and he wrote a book called Annals of Gullibility, which really describes why people are gullible, gives a bunch of case studies, and tells you how not to be gullible. And it turns out, of course, that he had a third of his retirement savings with the Madoff fund. So the guy who literally wrote the book got captured in the same kind of trap.
And that's a classic example of overconfidence, isn't it? That we all think that we're smarter than we turn out to be, and even in the field about which we know most, we can still be overconfident about our abilities.
Yeah, I mean, overconfidence, there are probably many different factors, but I think the key thing to stress is that just being smart doesn't mean you're going to make good decisions, because even smart people have the same mental software as everybody else. And in fact, some of the greatest mistakes or errors we've ever seen, and most consequential, are from people who are very smart people. So the whole theme of the book is learn about these kinds of situations, recognize them in the right context, and then apply tools to mitigate those possible mistakes.
And one of the biggest problems is this being influenced by the crowd or by what you've just read or seen. Another great example came out of the book was people who read about themes connected with the elderly walk more slowly immediately afterwards, which is just astonishing.
I think we talk about this in a couple different spots, but I think that, and this is actually one of the most disturbing ideas from the whole book, which is there are many influences in our context that are subconscious that we're not aware of that can actually truly and very meaningfully influence our decisions. So just the study you described it was actually anagrams. They give these people anagrams of neutral words and then anagrams of words associated with the elderly, gray hair, retirement, what have you. And it turns out that the real experiment was they're walking down the corridor after the test, and the people that had seen the old person words walked 13% slower.
So how can people use these insights as business people or investors to alter the way that they take decisions?
Right, so the first thing is to learn about them. And one example I'll give that I think is a very practical one is something called the inside-outside view. This has been well articulated by psychologists. The inside view says we take a problem or a challenge and we gather information that we have, and we sort of project our own view. It's almost kind of an idiosyncratic thing. So you say, I'm going to do a renovation to my house, or I'm going to launch a new product, or I'm going to be an executive doing a mergers and acquisitions deal. You sort of gather your own facts and this is where the optimism comes into play, and you sort of hope for the future, for the best for the future. People tend to be very miscalibrated when they do that. There's another way of looking at that problem. It's called the outside view, which is looking at your problem as a part of a larger reference class. And when you do that, you're basically asking the question, when other people were in this situation, what happened? So we can pick M&A as a great example. Yes. We know the aggregates, roughly 2/3 of the time, deals destroy value for the acquiring company. And this has been true for decades. There's nothing new about that. Yet every executive that does a deal believes that his or her deal is going to be the one that succeeds, right? So they're using the inside view and to some degree setting aside the outside view. So our minds naturally go to the inside view. This is why it's so difficult. But disciplining yourself as an executive or a business person to constantly take a look at the outside view, remind yourself of it, and implement that into your decision making can be one very, very valuable tool.
Is there also a question of making fewer decisions? I remember from your previous book, More Than You Know, the example that fund managers who turn over their portfolios less frequently outperform those who constantly trade. Obviously, for cost reasons is one example.
Right.
But there, if you're constantly making decisions, the chances are you're going on sort of short-term guesses rather than a fundamental analysis of the company. So maybe Warren Buffett used the example, you don't have to swing at the ball at every bit. You can wait for the one that you can hit for a home run. Is that another lesson?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there are two dimensions to that. And one you pointed out, which is very important, is cost. So just trading will incur costs, and that obviously will be detrimental to your performance. But the second thing is that when you're an investor, you really want to figure out situations where you have an edge, where you truly think you know something that the market doesn't know. And it turns out these are fairly scarce. It doesn't happen every single day.
Now, a lot of your work falls into the category of really behavioral finance, behavioral economics, and the criticism of the traditional school of economists is that these things are all very interesting. They make good psychological tests. They don't have any practical, testable propositions. Now, you're spending your time working at Legg Mason, the big fund management group, because you were a strategist before that.
Right.
How does what you do fit into the decisions that Legg Mason works, and how has it helped?
So let me first say I'm somewhat sympathetic to the economist's argument, even though I think that it's important to recognize that we as economic agents are suboptimal in many settings. It doesn't mean that suboptimal people don't lead to markets that are fairly robust. So it's very important to think about conditions under which markets are robust and conditions under which they're not robust. And I think that the behavioral finance enthusiasts have not really developed that fully. That said, what are we doing as an organization? There are many things, but one of the things I'll just mention specifically is thinking about the world from a probability perspective. Right? Very often you'll read analyst reports or you'll see someone on television, they'll talk about a price target, X multiple of Y earnings. Well, the reality, as we know, is that we don't know the future. It's going to be unknown, and the best we should be able to do is express things probabilistically. So one of the things we try to think a lot about as an organization is thinking about what are potential outcomes, for example, for a specific security, and assigning probabilities to those various outcomes, and then thinking much more in an expected value framework versus just a single number. So that opens up your mind a little bit, forces you to think about various alternatives, and I think leads to ultimately better decisions.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for talking to us.
Philip, it's a pleasure.